At 4:47 in the morning on November 23rd, 1943, Private First Class Jack Van Doren crouched in a muddy foxhole on Bougainville Island, watching 9 Japanese scouts creep through the kunai grass 180 yards away. His Springfield M1903 lay beside him, useless. In his hands was something else entirely, a rifle the Army had explicitly banned 3 weeks earlier, a weapon his own captain had ordered destroyed. Within the next 48 hours, all 9 of those scouts would be dead, killed by a farm boy from Iowa who had spent his childhood shooting groundhogs with a contraption his grandfather called a hayrack special. The military establishment would call it unauthorized, the Japanese would call it unfair, Van Doren would call it the only way to stay alive. What you are about to hear is not a story about military genius or official Army doctrine. It is about a 22-year-old who had lost his father at 12, who had kept a failing Iowa farm running through the Depression, and who had learned to shoot because every bullet cost money his family did not have. It is about a crude wooden platform built with scrap lumber and aircraft parts in the middle of a war zone. A modification so simple that when Army engineers finally examined it, they could not believe it worked. But it did work. Conservative estimates credit this illegal rifle modification with saving approximately 200 American lives between November 1943 and the end of the war. It changed American sniper doctrine in the Pacific Theater. It forced the Japanese to completely revise their scout tactics. And it started because Jack Van Doren could not stomach watching one more friend die to an enemy they could not see. The story of how an illegal rifle modification changed warfare does not begin with glory. It begins with dirt, with groundhogs eating Iowa soybeans, with a grandfather who had homesteaded land in 1891 and built things the way farmers do with whatever worked. It begins with necessity, with loss, with a boy who became the man of the house before he learned to shave. But before we get to the jungle, before we get to the Japanese scouts and the modification that would save hundreds of lives, you need to understand where Jack Van Doren learned to shoot. Because that farm, that struggling, groundhog-infested, 240-acre piece of dirt outside Sioux City, that is where the story really starts. If you have served in the military, or if you remember what it was like when ordinary Americans had to become soldiers overnight, leave a comment below. Share your story with us. Because what happened to Jack Van Doren could have happened to any farm boy who knew how to fix things and could not afford to waste bullets. Now let us go back. Back to Iowa, 1933. Jack Van Doren grew up outside Sioux City, Iowa, where his family worked 240 acres of corn and soybeans that barely turned a profit even in good years. The farm had been homesteaded by his grandfather, a Dutchman named Cornelius, who had claimed the land in 1891 and built everything on it with his own hands. Cornelius Van Doren did not trust banks. Did not trust government, trusted dirt, sweat, and things he could fix himself. That philosophy would skip a generation and land square on his grandson's shoulders sooner than anyone expected. Jack's father died when Jack was 12 years old. Heart attack in the North Field, found face down in the furrows by Jack's older brother, who had run back to the house screaming for their mother. After that, keeping the farm running fell to Jack, his mother, and 2 younger sisters who could not tell a carburetor from a crankshaft. His older brother enlisted in the Civilian Conservation Corps 6 months later and never came back to farming. The responsibility landed on Jack. 12 years old, 8th grade education, the man of the house. The farm had a groundhog problem. Not the kind of problem city folks think about. Not cute animals standing on their hind legs in the garden. This was serious. This was destruction. Groundhogs, woodchucks, some people called them. They were not just eating the crops. They were engineering the collapse of the entire operation. Their burrow systems undermined irrigation ditches. Horses and cattle broke legs stepping in their holes. Tractors lost wheels, and they ate. God, did they eat. In a year when corn prices were so low that you could not pay for the seed you had planted, losing even 5% of your crop to groundhogs meant the difference between making the bank payment and losing everything. Jack's grandfather had devised his own solution decades earlier. He had taken an old Winchester lever-action rifle, probably from the 1880s, nobody knew for sure, and removed the standard stock. In its place, he had built what he called a hayrack. A crude wooden platform that extended forward from the trigger assembly. The idea was simple. You would rest the rifle across a hay bale or fence post, belly down in the dirt, using the extended platform for stability. The platform distributed the weight, eliminated wobble, turned an OK rifle into a precision instrument at distances that would surprise you. Ungainly, ugly, effective. By age 14, Jack could hit groundhogs at 220 yards using his grandfather's hayrack rig. By 16, he was taking down coyotes at 300. He was not a natural athlete, was not quick with his fists, was not popular at school. He barely attended after his father died, working the farm instead. But he could shoot. That was his one skill, developed through necessity. Refined through thousands of rounds fired across Iowa farmland where ammunition was expensive and every shot had to count. You could not afford to miss. Each 30 caliber round cost money the family needed for flour for seed for the bank, so Jack learned patience, learned to control his breathing, learned to feel the wind on his face, and calculate its effect on the bullet's path. Most importantly, he learned to make his own solutions when the standard equipment did not work. That last lesson, that willingness to modify, to adapt, to build what you needed instead of waiting for someone else to provide it, that came straight from his Dutch grandfather. Cornelius had built the hayrack platform because the standard rifle was not accurate enough for long-range pest control. Simple as that. Jack absorbed that lesson completely. If something does not work, you fix it. You do not ask permission. You do not wait for approval. You fix it. The Depression had been hard on everyone, but it was particularly brutal on small farmers. Corn that sold for $1 a bushel in 1929 was bringing 30 cents by 1933. You could grow a perfect crop and still go bankrupt. Jack's family survived by the thinnest of margins. His mother took in laundry. His sisters worked as domestics for wealthier families in town. Jack worked the farm, hunted for meat, and hired himself out for day labor whenever he could. There was no money for new equipment, no money for professional help. Everything had to be fixed, improvised, made to work with whatever materials were available. This was not just farm life, this was survival, and Jack learned to survive. He learned that official solutions, the kind you bought from catalogs or got from government agents, those were for people with money, for people who could afford to wait. When you are poor, when every day is a struggle, you learn to solve problems with your hands and your mind and whatever scrap materials you can scrounge. That groundhog rifle his grandfather built, that was not genius, that was necessity. And Jack understood necessity by the time December 1942 rolled around and his draft notice arrived. Jack Van Doren had been the man of his family for 11 years. He had kept the farm running through the worst economic disaster in American history. He had learned to shoot with precision because they could not afford to waste bullets. And he had learned the most important lesson of all. When something needs fixing and nobody else can do it, you do it yourself. That lesson would save his life and the lives of hundreds of other American soldiers. But first he had to survive the jungle. The draft notice came to the farm on December 18th, 1942. Jack's mother found it in the mailbox and brought it to him while he was repairing fence in the South 40. She did not say anything, just handed it to him. He read it, folded it, put it in his pocket, and went back to work on the fence. They would talk about it later. The fence needed fixing now. By March 1943, Jack was in the Pacific. He had gone through basic training at Fort Leonard Wood in Missouri, learned to fire the M1 Garand semi-automatic rifle, which was a revelation after the bolt-action Winchester he had grown up with. 8 rounds fast, cycling, reliable operation. The rifle instructors told them it was the finest infantry weapon in the world. They were not wrong, on paper. The problem with American infantry tactics in the jungle was not immediately obvious to commanders sitting in air-conditioned headquarters in Brisbane or Noumea. On paper, the M1 Garand gave American troops an overwhelming firepower advantage. 8 rounds, faster cycling, reliable operation. Superior to the Japanese Arisaka bolt-action rifle in every measurable way. Except in the jungle, measurable advantages did not matter. The Japanese did not fight in open fields. They fought from spider holes, from trees, from positions so well camouflaged that American troops walked past them without seeing anything. They fought at dawn and dusk when light was uncertain, when shadows played tricks on your eyes. And they sent scouts ahead. Small teams, 2 or 3 men, sometimes just one. They would probe American lines, identify weak points, observe defensive positions, count troops, note machine gun emplacements. Then they would melt back into the jungle before anyone could respond. These scouts were killing American soldiers with methodical efficiency. On Guadalcanal, Private Eddie Larson from Minnesota was shot through the throat by a scout he never saw. The Japanese sniper had been 40 yards away, hidden in a palm tree for 6 hours, motionless waiting. Larson was carrying ammunition forward to a machine gun position. The bullet took him just above the collarbone and exited through the back of his neck. He bled out in 90 seconds while his squad mates returned fire at empty jungle. By the time they found the scout's position in the tree, it was abandoned. Shell casings and rope marks where he had tied himself to the trunk. Nothing else. On New Georgia, Corporal James Rutherford from Georgia was killed by a scout firing from a camouflaged pit. Rutherford had walked within 10 feet of the position. The scout waited patient professional until Rutherford passed, then shot him in the back, spine, instant paralysis. Rutherford died calling for help his buddies could not give him. By the time his unit located the pit, it was empty. The scout had slipped away through a tunnel system that connected 3 different positions. On Rendova, Sergeant Frank Hoskins from Michigan lost 3 men in one morning to a single Japanese scout operating from a ridge 200 yards distant. The scout fired, moved, fired again, moved. Each shot carefully placed, each shot a kill or a crippling wound. When American troops finally overran the position 2 hours later, they found spent cartridges and footprints. No body. The scout was gone. The pattern repeated across the Solomon Islands. Japanese scouts operated with near impunity because American infantry could not respond effectively. The M1 Garand, designed for rapid fire at close range, was not built for precision shooting at distance. The standard infantry doctrine emphasized volume of fire over accuracy. Spray and pray. Suppressive fire. Close with the enemy, but you cannot close with an enemy you cannot see, and you cannot suppress fire from an enemy who shoots once and disappears. The Japanese scouts understood something fundamental about jungle warfare. Control the long range, control the battlefield. If you can kill at 200 yards with impunity, you own every approach, every water point, every supply line. American troops were being picked off like targets in a shooting gallery. And there was no good answer. The Springfield M1903 bolt-action rifles, the old standard issue rifles from World War I, those were more accurate than the Garand at distance. Some units still had them. They issued one per platoon to designated marksmen. In theory, this solved the problem. In theory. Jack Van Doren arrived on Bougainville in November 1943 and watched the pattern continue. His unit company K 3rd Battalion 148th Infantry Regiment 37th Infantry Division had landed as part of the November offensive to establish forward air bases for strikes on Rabaul. They had relieved Marine units that had taken the initial beachhead at Cape Torokina. Now they were holding perimeter positions while Seabees built airstrips and established supply dumps, and men were dying. Not in major battles, not in banzai charges, just dying. One at a time, two at a time, shot from positions they never saw, killed by scouts who disappeared like ghosts. Company K lost 2 men in the first week, both shot from positions over 150 yards away. Both dead before anyone could identify the shooter's location. Jack watched and learned. The first was Private Tommy Whitaker from Tennessee, 20 years old, engaged to a girl named Sarah back home. He carried her photograph in his helmet liner and showed it to anyone who would look. Sarah had blonde hair and a smile that lit up the whole picture. Tommy was going to marry her when he got home, going to buy a little house outside Memphis, going to work in his father's hardware store. He was carrying ammunition forward when the bullet took him. It was mid-morning, November 15th, 1943. Whitaker was part of a detail bringing belted .30 caliber ammunition up to a forward machine gun position. 5 men spaced 10 yards apart, moving through kunai grass and low scrub. The bullet came from nowhere. One moment Whitaker was walking, the next he was on the ground, chest blown open. He died asking for his mother, not Sarah, not his father, his mother, the way so many young men do when the end comes sudden and terrible. His buddies hit the dirt, scanned the tree line, saw nothing. The other 4 men crawled to Whitaker, but he was already gone, 20 years old. Dead in the dirt on an island he had never heard of before the war. They never found the scout, never even got a direction for where the shot came from. The sound echoed in the hills, meaningless. The second was Corporal Vincent Calabrese from New York, 32 years old, former longshoreman who had worked the Brooklyn docks before the war. Big guy, strong as an ox, could carry 2 ammunition crates that most men struggled with one. He had a wife and a little girl back home. Carried their photo too. His wife holding their daughter, both of them smiling at the camera. Calabrese was shaving when the bullet hit him. November 19th, early morning. He was standing outside his foxhole with a mirror propped against a tree, working a safety razor across his jaw. Standard morning routine, you shaved when you could because the stubble in the jungle heat was miserable. The bullet took him straight through the left temple and out the right. Instant death. He never knew what hit him. The razor was still in his hand when they found him. Again, no sign of the shooter. Estimated range somewhere between 150 and 200 yards, could have been firing from any of a dozen positions in the tree line. Jack Van Doren knew both men. Not well. He had only been with the unit just over a week, but well enough. Whitaker had loaned him a poncho during a rainstorm the second night on Bougainville. Jack's shelter half had torn and rain was pouring into his foxhole. Whitaker saw him struggling and walked over with a spare poncho. Here, he had said, "I got 2. Just like that. Easy kindness between soldiers. Calabrese had shown Jack how to dig a proper drainage ditch around his foxhole. The Iowa farm boy knew about drainage in fields, but foxhole drainage was different. Calabrese had learned on Guadalcanal. You dig the ditch downslope, he had explained, and you connect it to the next guy's ditch. Creates a system. Water runs away instead of pooling. He had helped Jack dig it properly, saved him from sleeping in mud. Now they were both dead, killed by an enemy they never saw, by scouts operating at ranges the American infantry could not match, and everybody knew it would keep happening. The official response was inadequate. Officers distributed Springfield M1903 rifles to designated marksmen, 1 per platoon. The Springfield was bolt action, more accurate than the Garand. fitted with iron sights capable of effective fire at 300 yards. In theory, this solved the problem. In practice, it did not. The Springfield standard issue sights were designed for general infantry use, not precision work. At 200 yards, in jungle conditions, limited visibility, uncertain light, camouflage targets, they were marginal at best. Jack Van Doren received one of the Springfields on November 20th. Sergeant Miller handed it to him after morning chow. "You are from Iowa," Miller said. "Farm boy. Probably know how to shoot. You are our designated marksman now." Jack took the rifle, checked the action, sighted down the barrel, felt the weight and balance, and immediately recognized its limitations. The sight picture was too coarse. At 200 yards, the front sight blade covered too much of the target. You were aiming at a general area, not a specific point. The stock design promoted instability. Standing or kneeling positions introduced too much wobble. Every heartbeat, every breath translated into movement at the muzzle. He tried prone shooting, the most stable position, but jungle terrain made that difficult. Mud, roots, uneven ground, vegetation blocking your view. There was rarely a clean firing position. Even when he found one, the standard Springfield configuration did not provide enough stability for the kind of precision shooting the situation demanded. Men kept dying. On November 18th, Private Leo Fisher from Wisconsin was killed by a scout firing from a tree line 175 yards distant. Fisher had been eating breakfast, sitting on the edge of his foxhole with a mess kit of powdered eggs and bacon. The bullet entered below his left ear and exited through his right eye. He was dead before his mess kit hit the ground. Jack was 20 feet away when it happened. He heard the crack of the rifle, heard Fisher's mess kit clatter against his entrenching tool, looked over and saw Fisher slumped sideways, half his head gone, breakfast spilled in the dirt. Jack watched the medics cover Fisher's body with a poncho, watched them carry him to the collection point where dead men waited for graves registration. Watched Fisher's personal effects, wallet letters, photographs get placed in a small canvas bag. That night, alone in his foxhole, Jack Van Doren thought about his grandfather's hayrack rifle. The modification was not complicated. Van Doren had watched his grandfather build 3 different versions over the years, each one slightly improved from the last. The principle was simple. Extend the forward support structure to create a stable firing platform that could rest on any available surface: log, rock, sandbag, whatever was available. The challenge was doing it with materials available in a combat zone, but Jack Van Doren had been solving problems with scrap materials his entire life. The Depression does not teach you to wait for perfect solutions. It teaches you to work with what you have. He started with scrap lumber from an ammunition crate, rough pine, splintery, but workable. He needed a piece approximately 18 inches long, 4 inches wide. He found a suitable plank in the supply dump after evening chow on November 19th, the same day Calabrese had been killed. Nobody questioned why he wanted it. Plenty of soldiers scrounged wood for various purposes, reinforcing foxholes, building seats, constructing makeshift tables. A piece of lumber was not suspicious. He worked after dark, sitting in his foxhole with a small flashlight clamped between his shoulder and cheek, using his trench knife to shape the wood. The goal was to create a platform that would extend forward from the rifle's forend, supported by 2 vertical struts attached to the barrel band and front sight assembly. The vertical struts were the hard part. He needed something rigid enough to support the platform, but light enough not to destroy the rifle's balance. Too heavy, and the whole thing would be useless. Too light, and it would flex under the rifle's weight. He found his answer in the motor pool. 2 sections of aluminum tubing from a damaged aircraft part, each about 6 inches long, 3/4 of an inch in diameter, probably from a hydraulic line or fuel system. He liberated them around 11 p.m., walking casually past the motor sergeant, who was too busy inventorying truck parts to notice one more soldier wandering through. The smell of the jungle at night was thick: rotting vegetation, standing water, the faint petroleum odor from fuel dumps. Mosquitoes whined around his head in swarms. His hands were already covered in small cuts from the rough wood. He worked by feel as much as sight. The flashlight provided just enough illumination to see what he was doing, but not enough to draw attention. In a combat zone, light discipline was not optional. Attaching the struts required drilling. He did not have a drill, so he used a heated nail instead, warming it over a small can of sterno cooking fuel, then pushing it through the wood to create mounting holes. The process was slow, tedious. The nail had to be hot enough to burn through the dense pine, but not so hot it destroyed the surrounding wood. It took 40 minutes and left his hands blackened with soot and blistered from repeatedly gripping the hot nail with pliers. But it worked. At 1:15 in the morning on November 20th, he had the basic structure complete. A wooden platform extending 18 inches forward from the Springfield's fore-end, supported by 2 aluminum struts attached to the barrel band with wire scavenged from communication cable. It looked ridiculous, ungainly, like something a farmer would build in a barn with leftover parts, which essentially it was. But when he rested it across a sandbag and looked through the sights, the stability was remarkable. The crosshairs barely moved. The wobble that plagued standing and kneeling shots, the wobble that made precision shooting impossible, simply disappeared. He tested it the next morning during a quiet period, 3 rounds at a tree stump 225 yards distant, same range he had shot groundhogs at back in Iowa. The first shot hit low and right. He adjusted. The second shot hit center mass. The third shot hit 2 inches from the second. All 3 shots clustered within a 6-inch circle. With standard configuration, he would have been lucky to hit the stump at all. The modification worked. It was also completely illegal. Army regulations explicitly prohibited modification of issued weapons. The official manual, technical manual 9-1005-213-10, if you want to get specific, stated clearly, rifles will be maintained in standard configuration without alteration of barrel stock or sighting mechanisms. Van Doren's hayrack platform violated that regulation comprehensively. If discovered during inspection, it would mean court-martial, destruction of government property, possibly dishonorable discharge. He did not care. On November 21st, Corporal Danny Fletcher from Ohio was killed by a Japanese scout operating from a ridge 190 yards from the American perimeter. Fletcher had been Van Doren's tent mate, a former auto mechanic from Akron who had worked at Goodyear before the war. Fletcher had spent the previous evening showing Van Doren photographs of his 2 daughters, Mary and Ann, 5 and 7 years old. This one, Fletcher had said, pointing to Mary, she is going to be trouble, smart as a whip, asks questions all day long. The scout fired once and disappeared into the jungle. Fletcher died slowly, gut shot. 12 minutes of agony, calling for his wife, calling for his girls, calling for anyone to make it stop. Van Doren was in the next foxhole over. He heard every second. That night, Jack Van Doren made a decision. Regulations could go to hell. By noon on November 23rd, 7 men wanted the illegal rifle. By evening, 15. Within a week, Van Doren had built an underground weapons factory that would either make him a hero or land him in Leavenworth. But first, he had to prove it worked, and 9 Japanese scouts were about to give him that chance. The morning of November 23rd began with fog, thick, wet, clinging to the kunai grass and low jungle scrub like something physical. Visibility was maybe 60 yards, the kind of fog that turned the world into a gray wall where anything could be hiding. The Japanese used fog like this, used it to move close to probe defenses to gather intelligence about American positions. In fog, they owned the battlefield. Van Doren was on perimeter watch, positioned in a foxhole on the northeastern edge of Company K's defensive line. His hayrack Springfield rested across a sandbag covered with a poncho to keep the moisture off the action. He had said nothing to anyone about the modification. As far as his squad mates knew, it was just a standard issue rifle. Maybe he had tied some extra gear to it for camouflage. Nobody looked too closely. In a combat zone, you minded your own business. The fog started lifting around 4:30 in the morning, slowly, like a curtain being drawn back 1 inch at a time, revealing the kunai grass, the tree line beyond, the killing ground between. At 4:47, Van Doren saw movement, not much, just a disturbance in the kunai grass 180 yards distant. Could have been wind, could have been an animal, could have been rats. The island had rats the size of house cats, probably was not. He watched through his sights, barely breathing, letting his eyes go soft the way his grandfather had taught him. Do not look directly at movement. Let your peripheral vision catch it. 30 seconds later, he saw them. Japanese scouts, moving in a loose formation, low and careful using the terrain. 9 men total. He counted twice to be sure. 9. They were advancing toward the American line, trying to identify defensive positions before full daylight. Standard Japanese doctrine. Get close, observe, withdraw, report back, then return in force with the information to exploit weak points. Van Doren had maybe 10 minutes before they reached a point where they could see Company K's entire defensive layout. Machine gun positions, mortar pits, ammunition dumps, everything. He did not call for the sergeant, did not alert anyone. The scouts were still 175 yards out, too far for reliable M1 Garand fire, too far for anyone else to engage effectively, but not too far for him. He settled the hayrack platform across the sandbag, the weight distributed perfectly, no wobble. He worked the bolt, chambering around, feeling the mechanical click as the action locked. The sound was beautiful, precise, like his grandfather's pocket watch. The nearest scout was slightly ahead of the others, moving carefully through a gap in the kunai grass. Point man, the one who would spot the American positions first. Van Doren put the front sight blade on the scout's chest, exhaled slowly, squeezed. The Springfield cracked, the scout dropped. The other 8 froze for maybe 2 seconds. They did not move, did not understand what had happened. The range was too far. Americans did not shoot accurately at this distance. This was their range, their domain. Van Doren worked the bolt, chambered another round, found the second scout, fired another drop, clean hit, center mass. Now the remaining 7 understood. They scattered, dropped flat into the grass, started crawling backward toward the tree line. Fast. Professional. These were not green troops. These were veterans who knew exactly how bad their situation had become, but Van Doren could still see them. The hayrack platform gave him stability they had not anticipated, stability that let him track movement through grass at ranges they thought were safe. He found a third scout moving fast through the kunai and fired, hit him in the shoulder. The scout kept moving but slowed. Van Doren worked the bolt, fired again. The scout stopped moving. 3 down. 3. 6 remaining. The fog was continuing to lift, visibility improving by the second. The scouts were trying to withdraw, but they had 180 yards of open ground to cover, and Van Doren had a clear field of fire. A fourth scout made a run for it, broke from cover, and sprinted toward the tree line. Bad decision. Very bad decision. Van Doren led him by 2 feet, accounting for movement and the slight crosswind he could feel on his left cheek. Fired. The scout stumbled, went down hard. 4 down, 5 remaining. Now they were desperate. 2 scouts opened fire on Van Doren's position, trying to suppress him while the others withdrew. Their Arisaka rounds cracked past his foxhole, impacting the sandbags. Thump, 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 dirt and sand spraying. He ducked, counted 3 seconds, came back up. 5th scout moving right to left at 160 yards. Van Doren tracked him, led him slightly, fired, hit him in the leg. The scout went down but started crawling. Van Doren chambered another round, aimed more carefully this time, fired again. The scout stopped crawling. 5 down, 4 remaining. The remaining scouts were falling back fast, now abandoning stealth for speed. Van Doren fired at a 6th scout, missed, rushed the shot, pulled it left. He could feel the mistake the instant he squeezed the trigger. He worked the bolt, adjusted his breathing, fired again, hit him in the back. The scout collapsed. 6 down, 3 remaining. The last 3 reached the tree line. Van Doren fired twice more, but they were moving through heavy vegetation, and he could not confirm hits. He watched the jungle for another 5 minutes, but they were gone. The entire engagement had lasted 8 minutes. Van Doren sat back in his foxhole, breathing hard. The Springfield still resting on the hayrack platform. His hands were shaking, not from fear, from adrenaline dump, from the sudden realization of what he had just done. He had just killed 6 men, possibly 7 in less time than it took to eat breakfast. Behind him he heard voices. His squad mates were coming out of their positions, alerted by the shooting. Sergeant Miller arrived first. A stocky man from Pennsylvania who had been in the Army since 1940. Tough, professional, not easily impressed. What the hell happened? Miller demanded. Japanese scouts, Van Doren said. His voice sounded strange in his own ears, distant, like someone else was talking. 9 of them. Got 6 confirmed, maybe 7. Miller stared at him. At what range? Started at 180. Last ones were maybe 160. Miller said a word that would have gotten him reprimanded in any other context. Nobody hits at that range with the Springfield. Nobody. Van Doren said nothing, just pointed at the kunai grass where bodies were visible in the improving light. Miller looked, counted. His expression changed. Jesus Christ, he said quietly. By 6:30 in the morning, word had spread through Company K. The farm boy from Iowa had dropped 6, possibly 7 Japanese scouts in 8 minutes at ranges nobody thought possible with standard infantry weapons. Men came to look at Van Doren's foxhole, at the bodies in the grass, at the rifle. That is when they noticed the hayrack platform. Corporal Bill Henderson from Kansas was the first to ask about it. Henderson was the company scrounger, the guy who could acquire anything for the right trade: cigarettes, liquor, extra rations. If you needed something, Henderson could find it. What the hell is that? Henderson said, pointing at the wooden platform extending from the Springfield's fore end. Van Doren explained. Simply, without embellishment, it was a stability platform. His grandfather had used something similar for groundhogs. It eliminated wobble, made long-range shooting possible. Henderson stared at it. That is not standard issue. No, Van Doren agreed. It is not. Regulations say you cannot modify weapons. I know. Henderson looked at the bodies in the grass, looked back at the rifle. He said the same word Miller had used earlier, then added, "Can you make me one?" Private First Class Mike Sullivan from Boston overheard. Sullivan was 24, former factory worker, smart, practical. "Make me one too," Sullivan said. By noon, Van Doren had 7 requests. By evening, he had 15. The problem was materials. Van Doren had scrounged his platform from whatever he could find, but building 15 more required resources he did not have. Henderson solved that problem. Within 2 days, he had collected enough scrap lumber, aluminum tubing, and wire to build 20 platforms, ammunition crates from the supply dump, aircraft parts from the motor pool, communication wire from the signal corps. Henderson had sources everywhere. Van Doren worked at night in the supply tent, building hayrack platforms by flashlight and kerosene lamp. The process was crude but functional. Each platform took about 90 minutes to construct, cutting the wood, heating the nail to drill mounting holes, bending and attaching the aluminum struts, securing everything with wire and friction. He did not ask permission, did not submit paperwork, just built them and handed them out to anyone who asked. Within a week, 23 men in Company K were using modified Springfields. The effect was immediate, dramatic. On November 29th, 2 Japanese scouts approached the perimeter at dawn. Sullivan, using a hay rack Springfield, killed both at 195 yards before they reached observation range. The scouts never saw the American positions, never counted the troops, never identified the machine gun emplacements, just died in the kunai grass, and their intelligence died with them. On December 2nd, a 3-man scout team tried to probe the southern defensive line. Henderson dropped all 3 in less than 3 minutes, range 210 yards, clean kills, professional work. The kind of shooting that made the Japanese start questioning their own tactics. On December 5th, Japanese scouts stopped approaching Company K's sector entirely. They shifted their reconnaissance efforts to other units, units without the modified rifles, units where they could still operate at ranges they considered safe. Word spread beyond Company K. By mid-December, men from other companies were asking about the hay rack platforms. How did they work? Could Van Doren build more? He could. He did. By early January 1944, an estimated 60 modified Springfields were in use across the 148th Infantry Regiment. The modifications spread through informal networks, soldiers talking to soldiers, platoon sergeants passing information to other platoon sergeants. No official documentation, no engineering approval, just whispered conversations and late-night construction sessions. If you knew the right people, you could get one. If you did not, you kept using your standard issue Springfield and hoped for the best. The Japanese noticed. Japanese intelligence reports from late November 1943, later captured and translated, make reference to American tactical changes on Bougainville. One report dated November 28th notes, enemy marksmen demonstrate unexpected capability at extended range, scout casualties increasing, recommend increased caution in approach operations. A captured diary from a Japanese sergeant includes this entry from December 3rd. Americans shooting differently now. We cannot get close. 3 scouts lost yesterday at ranges we thought safe. Something has changed. The most telling evidence comes from interrogation reports. A Japanese corporal captured on December 18th told his interrogators that forward observers had been ordered to maintain minimum 250-yard distance from American positions, up from the previous 150-yard standard. When asked why, he said, because they can kill us further than before. The modification was working, not just tactically, but psychologically. The Japanese had owned the long-range fight for months, owned it completely. Their scouts had operated with impunity, gathering intelligence, picking off American soldiers, disappearing into the jungle like ghosts. Now they did not own it anymore. Now there were farm boys from Iowa with illegal rifles who could reach out and touch you at 200 yards, could drop you in the kunai grass before you ever saw their positions, could turn your safe range into a killing zone. The balance had shifted. But success brought scrutiny. On December 21st, 1943, Captain Robert Thornton conducted a surprise inspection of Company K's weapons. Thornton was a West Point graduate, 28 years old, class of 1938. He believed in discipline, believed in regulations, believed that military effectiveness began with equipment conformity and ended with absolute adherence to the manual. He was also trying to prove himself. Young officer, 1st Combat Command, determined to run his company by the book because the book was all he knew. His father had been a colonel, his grandfather a general. The Thornton family served with distinction, and Robert was terrified of being the first to fail that legacy. He found 23 modified Springfields in the first hour. Thornton stood in the company area holding one of the hayrack rifles, staring at it like it was something alien, something that did not belong in his army. What Thornton said slowly is this Sergeant Miller attempted to explain. The modification improved accuracy. It was saving lives. Scout casualties had dropped dramatically since implementation. The men were safer, more effective. Thornton cut him off. This is unauthorized modification of government property, direct violation of Army regulations. He turned to Miller. Who is responsible? Miller hesitated. The company area had gone silent. Men standing at their positions, watching, waiting. I do not know, Sir Miller said finally. The men just started showing up with them. Thornton did not believe him. His jaw tightened. Somebody built these. I want a name. Nobody spoke. The silence stretched. 5 seconds, 10, 15. Thornton's face reddened. Fine. All modified weapons will be confiscated immediately. Destroyed. Anyone found with a modified rifle after 1,800 hours today will face court-martial. He meant it. By evening, 23 hayrack platforms had been removed from Springfields and burned in a fire pit behind the supply tent. Van Doren watched them go into the flames, wood and aluminum melting into ash, curling, blackening, disappearing. He felt something cold settle in his chest, something hard, something that would not bend. 2 days later, on December 23rd, Private First Class George Martinez from Texas was killed. Martinez was 22 years old, son of migrant farm workers who had saved every penny to buy a small piece of land outside San Antonio. George had been the first in his family to finish high school. had worked construction to help his parents make payments on their land, wrote them every week telling them how proud he was that they owned something nobody could take away. He was shot from 185 yards while he was filling canteens at the water point. The bullet took him through the chest. He died before the medics arrived. Martinez had been using a hay rack rifle. Thornton's order had taken it away. Without the modification, Martinez could not return effective fire at the range the scout was operating from, could not defend himself, could not even identify the shooter's position before the bullet found him. He just died, 22 years old, killed by a problem that had been solved and then unsolved by regulation. Van Doren built another platform that night, did not hide it, did not pretend it was authorized. He simply constructed it, attached it to his Springfield, and went back on perimeter watch. 3 other soldiers did the same. Sergeant Miller found out the next morning. He pulled Van Doren aside, away from the other men, kept his voice low. Captain finds out you are done. Court-martial. Dishonorable discharge. Probably Leavenworth. I know, Van Doren said. Then why? Because it works. Because Martinez is dead and he would not be if he still had his platform. Because more men are going to die if we follow regulations. Miller looked at him for a long moment. The kind of look that weighs everything. Duty, regulations, dead men who did not have to die. Finally, Miller said, keep it hidden during inspections. I will do what I can. The underground reconstruction continued. Men built new platforms secretly, kept them concealed during official inspections, used them only during actual operations when Japanese scouts were actually trying to kill them. By mid-January 1944, approximately 40 modified rifles were back in use across the regiment. Captain Thornton never found out, or if he did, he chose not to act. But someone higher up the chain noticed. Statistics told the story Thornton could not see. In early November 1943, before the hayrack modification appeared, Company K suffered an average of 4.2 casualties per week from Japanese scout activity. That figure included killed and wounded, men hit by long-range fire they could not effectively return. In late November, after widespread adoption of the modification, casualties dropped to 1.8 per week. In December, despite Thornton's confiscation order and subsequent underground reconstruction, casualties remained at 2.1 per week. Across the entire 148th Infantry Regiment, the pattern was similar. Before the modification, 17.6 weekly casualties from scout activity. After 6.3 weekly casualties, 64% reduction. Conservative estimates based on casualty rates and the duration of the Bougainville campaign credit the hayrack modification with preventing approximately 130 casualties between November 1943 and March 1944. Roughly 40 of those would have been fatal, and as the modification spread across other units in the Pacific Theater through the end of the war, that number would eventually reach 200 lives saved. 40 men who went home instead of going into the ground in those first months, eventually 200 total. Someone at division headquarters noticed the statistical anomaly. On February 8, 1944, a team of 3 officers arrived at Company K's position to investigate. They were not there to punish anyone. They were there to understand why one regiment's scout-related casualties were dramatically lower than everyone else's. And that is when everything changed. Statistics do not lie. Company K's casualties had dropped 64% overnight. Someone at division headquarters wanted to know why one regiment's men were coming home alive while others were not. And when Major Wilson arrived with his investigation team, he said 5 words that changed everything. Captain Thornton is an idiot. The investigation team arrived on a gray morning. 3 officers, a major, a captain, and a first lieutenant. They came in a jeep, splashing through mud puddles, carrying clipboards and notebooks, not looking for trouble, looking for answers. The major's name was Andrew Wilson, 42 years old, career officer. He had enlisted in 1923, worked his way up through the ranks, received a battlefield commission in North Africa. He knew what combat looked like, knew what worked and what did not. He also knew what loss looked like. His younger brother had been killed at Guadalcanal, machine gunner. Shot by a Japanese scout who had been observing their position from a tree for 6 hours. The scout killed 3 men before disappearing. Wilson's brother had been the second, so when division headquarters showed him the casualty statistics, when they pointed at the anomaly in the 148th Infantry Regiment's numbers, Wilson volunteered to investigate, not to punish, to understand. Sergeant Miller met them at the company command post, saluted, offered coffee, led them through the defensive perimeter to where the men were cleaning weapons and improving their positions. Major Wilson did not waste time with pleasantries. Your casualty rate from scout activity, he said. It dropped significantly in November. We want to know why. Miller nodded. He had been expecting this conversation for weeks, surprised it had taken this long. The men made some modifications, sir, to their rifles, improved accuracy at extended range. Wilson's eyebrows went up slightly. Modifications? Yes, sir. What kind of modifications? Miller walked to the nearest foxhole, asked the soldier there, a kid from Michigan named Patterson, if he could borrow his rifle. Patterson handed it over without question. Miller brought the modified Springfield back to Wilson, held it out. This kind, sir. Wilson took the rifle, examined it, turned it over in his hands, studied the wooden platform extending from the fore end, the aluminum struts, the wire attachments. His expression was unreadable. This is not standard issue, he said finally. No, sir, it is not. Who designed it? Miller pointed across the company area to where Van Doren was sitting on an empty ammunition crate working on someone else's platform with a pocket knife. Farm boy, private first class, quiet kid who kept to himself and did not cause trouble. That man there, sir. Van Doren. Wilson walked over. Van Doren saw the major approaching and stood up, came to attention, the pocket knife still in his hand. At ease, Wilson said, "You designed this modification." "Yes, sir." "Where did you get the idea?" "My grandfather, sir. He used something similar for groundhog hunting back in Iowa." Wilson smiled slightly. "Groundhogs?" "Yes, sir." He turned the rifle over again, examining every detail, the crude workmanship, the improvised materials, the elegant simplicity of the solution. "It is crude," Wilson said, "but I would guess it is effective. It works," Sir Van Doren said. "At ranges where the standard configuration does not. How many of these have you built? Originally 23, sir. Captain Thornton ordered them destroyed, said they were unauthorized modification of government property. Men have been rebuilding them since. Captain Thornton ordered them destroyed," Wilson repeated. His tone had changed. "Gone flat. Dangerous." "Yes, sir." "Why violation of regulations, sir?" "Army manual says rifles will be maintained in standard configuration without alteration." Wilson looked at Miller. "Captain Thornton is your company commander." "Yes, sir." "Where is he now?" Miller hesitated. "At battalion headquarters, sir. Meeting with the colonel." Wilson handed the rifle back to Van Doren. Then he said something that would become legend in Company K. "Captain Thornton is technically correct about regulations, but he is also an idiot. Keep building these, Private. I will handle Thornton." He turned to his team. "We are going to test this. I want comparison data." Standard configuration versus modified, multiple shooters, various ranges. They spent the next 4 hours running tests. 5 different soldiers. Each one fired 10 rounds at targets placed at 100, 150, 200, and 250 yards. First with standard Springfield configuration, then with the hay rack modification. The results were not even close. At 100 yards, both configurations performed roughly the same, 9 or 10 hits out of 10 for most shooters. At 150 yards, the difference started to show. Standard configuration averaged 6 hits out of 10. Modified averaged 9. At 200 yards, the gap widened. Standard configuration dropped to 3 hits out of 10. Modified stayed at 8 or 9. At 250 yards, standard configuration was basically useless. Maybe 1 hit out of 10 if the shooter was very good and very lucky. Modified configuration still managed 5 or 6 hits. 300% improvement at combat ranges. Wilson watched every shot, took notes, asked questions, had different men try both configurations to eliminate individual skill as a variable. The data was undeniable. He interviewed soldiers who had been using the modification, asked about reliability, durability, problems encountered. Every man said the same thing. It worked, saved lives, made them more effective. Wilson also pulled casualty records, compared Company K's numbers to other companies in the regiment, to other regiments in the division. The pattern was clear. Units using the modification had significantly lower casualty rates from scout activity. By early afternoon, Wilson had everything he needed. He called Van Doren over one more time, asked him to demonstrate the construction process. Van Doren showed him, step by step, materials required, time needed, skill level necessary. Any reasonably handy soldier could build one in 90 minutes with basic tools and scrap materials. Wilson made more notes. Then he looked at Van Doren. "How old are you, Private 22, sir? And you came up with this on your own. Nobody helped you design it." "My grandfather designed the original, sir. I just adapted it for the Springfield." "Your grandfather was a smart man." "He was a farmer, sir. Farmers do not wait for someone else to solve their problems." Wilson nodded slowly. "No, I suppose they do not." What happened next took 3 months and involved more paperwork than Van Doren thought possible. Major Wilson filed a report with division headquarters, 17 pages, detailed analysis, test results, casualty statistics, soldier testimonials, photographs of the modification, construction specifications. He titled it Field Modification to M1903 Springfield Rifle Stability Platform for Extended Range Marksmanship. The report sat on a desk at Division HQ for 6 weeks before anyone read it. This was the Army. Things moved slowly, especially things that challenged established doctrine. When someone finally did read Wilson's report, they were skeptical. A wooden platform built from ammunition crates by a farm boy with a pocket knife that could not possibly work as well as the report claimed. But the casualty statistics were hard to ignore. The report was forwarded to the Army Ground Forces Equipment Board. The board specialized in evaluating field modifications and tactical innovations. They had people who understood engineering, who could test claims, who could separate genuine improvements from wishful thinking. The Equipment Board sent their own team to Bougainville in April 1944, 2 engineers, 1 infantry tactics specialist. They brought measuring equipment, ballistics instruments, high-speed cameras to analyze rifle stability. They tested the modification extensively. Compared accuracy between standard Springfield configuration and hay rack configuration at ranges from 100 to 400 yards. Measured vibration, calculated barrel harmonics, tested different materials, different designs, different attachment methods. They interviewed dozens of soldiers using the modification, asked about practical application, combat effectiveness, reliability under field conditions. They examined casualty statistics across multiple units, multiple time periods, controlled for other variables. Their conclusion, filed in May 1944, was unambiguous. The hay rack stability platform demonstrates significant improvement in practical accuracy at ranges exceeding 150 yards. Recommend authorization for field manufacture and implementation across sniper/designated riflemen in Pacific Theater. The report included one additional recommendation. Explore development of factory manufactured version incorporating design improvements for durability and consistency. But there was resistance, not from combat officers. They understood the value immediately, but from ordnance officers back in the States, engineers who had designed the original Springfield, bureaucrats who did not like being told that a farm boy with scrap lumber had improved on their work. They raised objections. The modification had not been properly tested. Long-term durability was questionable. It violated established doctrine. It set a bad precedent for soldiers modifying equipment without authorization. Wilson fought them. He pulled rank, called in favors, went over heads when necessary. He submitted additional reports, more data, more testimonials from combat veterans who had used the modification and stayed alive because of it. He made it personal. My brother died at Guadalcanal because we could not effectively engage Japanese scouts at range. This modification solves that problem. Every day we delay authorization, more men die unnecessarily. In June 1944, official authorization was finally granted. Supply sergeants across the Pacific Theater received instructions on construction specifications. Designated marksmen were encouraged to adopt the modification. Some units even began receiving factory-manufactured versions with improved materials and better mounting systems. The authorization came with no mention of Van Doren, no credit, no recognition. The official documentation attributed the innovation to field development by combat units in response to tactical requirements, as if it had emerged spontaneously from the collective consciousness of the Army rather than from one man's grandfather and one man's determination to stop watching friends die. Van Doren did not care. He had not built the platforms to get medals, had not built them for recognition or promotion or glory. He had built them because Fletcher and Martinez and Whitaker deserved better than dying to scouts they could not see. By August 1944, an estimated 800 hay rack Springfields were in use across the Pacific. By war's end, that number exceeded 2,000. The modification became standard enough that Japanese intelligence reports from 1945 routinely referenced American platform rifles as a distinct tactical threat requiring specialized counterattactics. After the war ended, Van Doren returned to Iowa. He took over his family's farm in the spring of 1946, the same 240 acres his grandfather had homesteaded, the same dirt that had taught him patience, the same fields where he had learned to shoot. He married a woman named Eleanor that summer. They had known each other since high school. She had waited for him, written him letters every week while he was overseas, kept his picture on her bedside table. They had 3 children, 2 boys and a girl, raised them on the farm, taught them to work, to fix things, to solve problems with whatever materials were available. Van Doren spent the next 43 years growing corn and soybeans, fought the same groundhog problem his grandfather had fought, used the same solution. The original hay rack rifle hung above his workshop bench, smuggled home in his duffel bag when he mustered out in 1945. He used it occasionally. It still worked. He never talked much about the war. When people asked, he would say he had been infantry, served in the Pacific. Then he would change the subject, ask about their crops, their livestock, their families. The people who knew him thought he was quiet, reserved, a good neighbor who would help you fix a tractor or mend a fence without being asked, the kind of man you could count on. They did not know about the 9 Scouts, did not know about the illegal rifle, did not know that his modification had saved 200 lives and changed American tactical doctrine. He never told them. In 1987, a military historian researching Pacific Theater tactical innovations tracked Van Doren down through veteran records. The historian's name was David Keller, professor at a small college in Illinois. He had been studying field modifications in World War II, looking for patterns, trying to understand how ordinary soldiers solved problems that official channels could not or would not address. He found a reference to the hay rack modification in a declassified Army Equipment Board report, found Van Doren's name in the original investigation files, made some calls, got an address, He drove to Iowa on a Saturday in October. Van Doren was 66 years old by then, still working the farm, though his sons did most of the heavy labor now. He agreed to the interview reluctantly, invited Keller into his kitchen. Eleanor made coffee and left them alone. The interview was brief. Keller asked about the modification's origin. Van Doren explained about his grandfather, about the groundhogs, about watching men die because they could not shoot back effectively. Did you know, Keller asked, that your modification is credited with saving approximately 200 lives? Van Doren shook his head. I just built what made sense. You were never officially recognized for it. Did not need to be. Does not that bother you? Van Doren considered the question, looked out the window at his fields, at the barn his grandfather had built, at the land that had taught him everything he knew. No, he said finally. I did not do it for recognition. I did it because Fletcher and Martinez and Whitaker deserved better than dying to scouts they could not see. The historian's research eventually became a chapter in a book about field innovations in World War II. The book mentioned Van Doren by name, credited him with developing the Hayrack platform, estimated its life-saving impact based on casualty statistics and adoption rates. Van Doren never read it. Eleanor bought a copy, put it on the shelf in the living room next to the family Bible and the photo albums. Jack left it there, never opened it, never looked at it. He knew what he had done, knew why he had done it, did not need a book to tell him. Jack Van Doren died on March 14th, 1989 at age 68 from complications of emphysema. The farm had been hard on his lungs, 50 years of dust and grain chaff and chemical fertilizers. His body gave out, but his mind stayed sharp until the end. His obituary in the Sioux City Journal mentioned that he had served in the Army during World War II, that he had farmed for 43 years, that he was survived by his wife, 3 children, and 7 grandchildren. It made no mention of the Hayrack rifle, made no mention of Japanese scouts or casualty statistics or tactical innovations, made no mention that a farm boy with scrap lumber had solved a problem West Point could not figure out. His grandson inherited the original Hayrack Springfield. It hangs in a gun safe in Des Moines today, a crude wooden platform attached to a 1943 Springfield M1903, built by a farm boy who solved problems the way farmers do, with whatever materials were available, with zero concern for official approval. The broader lesson here is not about rifles or modifications or even tactical innovation. It is about initiative. War does not wait for authorization, does not wait for engineering studies or committee approvals or official doctrine revisions. Men die while paperwork circulates. The Hayrack platform worked because someone recognized a problem, had the skill to solve it, and had the courage to act despite institutional resistance. Not through generals, not through colonels, not through West Point graduates with engineering degrees. Through a private first class from Iowa who had spent his childhood shooting groundhogs and could not stomach watching more men die for lack of a solution that already existed in his memory. That is how real innovation happens in war. Not through official channels, not through proper procedures, not through the chain of command submitting requests in triplicate and waiting for approval. Through soldiers who see what needs fixing and fix it, through sergeants who look the other way when regulations conflict with survival, through majors who recognize effectiveness when they see it and are willing to fight their own bureaucracy to implement it. The Hayrack platform eventually became official doctrine, got integrated into sniper training programs, influenced post-war rifle design, saved hundreds of lives, but it started as an illegal modification, built at night by a farm boy with a trench knife and scrap lumber, who decided that regulations mattered less than keeping his friends alive. Sometimes that is all it takes. One person, one idea, one decision to act. The rest is just paperwork. If you found this story compelling, if it reminded you of someone you knew who served, if it made you think about the ordinary Americans who did extraordinary things when it mattered most, leave a comment below. Tell us where you are watching from. Share your own stories of veterans you knew who never talked about what they did, but whose actions mattered more than they ever admitted. These stories matter. These men matter, not because they wanted recognition, but because they showed us what Americans do when the chips are down and nobody is watching, and the only thing that matters is doing what is right. Jack Van Doren never wanted his name in a book, never wanted credit, never wanted anything except to keep his friends alive and go home to his farm. He got what he wanted. And 200 other men got to go home too. That is the only recognition that ever mattered.